All right. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Heather Esper with the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. At WDI, I lead our performance measurement and impact work. As an independent nonprofit affiliated with the University of Michigan, we collaborate with businesses, mission-driven organizations, and governments to strengthen markets, scale innovation, and create sustainable impact. Today, I'm joined with my colleague, Abdullahi Ibrahim. He's Senior Mural Coordinator at LEAP Africa. LEAP Africa is a youth-focused leadership development organization dedicated to raising dynamic, innovative, and ethical leaders across Africa. Through programs targeting education, entrepreneurship, employability, active citizenship, and health and well-being, LEAP Africa empowers young people to drive positive change in their communities and contribute to national development. During today's session, we're going to explore how participatory approaches enhance program effectiveness and inclusivity by actively engaging stakeholders in design, decision-making, and evaluation. Given the broad ecosystem that LEAP Africa and WDI operate in, we're going to share examples of various participatory methods and how they can help ensure accelerators and incubators drive innovation by incorporating the perspective of entrepreneurs and their communities into programming. Before we dive in, a few announcements and housekeeping. We'd like to thank Glocal and the Global Evaluation Initiative for this platform. In case you're interested, WDI has another session tomorrow called Bridging Business Growth, Community Involvement, and Women's Empowerment. The session with Pro Mujer and CARE will highlight the relationship between business and social metrics, demonstrating why the return on investment is an important metric that can be further enhanced through qualitative data and storytelling. We'll showcase how a broader understanding of value creation through community engagement and technical assistance measurement strategies can both improve social impact and business benefits. And I'll put that in the chat so you guys can register for it if you're interested. All right, let's turn to today's session. We love a lively chat, so we would love if you could introduce yourself in the chat. Say one word about what participatory means to you. You can include where you're calling from, and if you wish, share your LinkedIn profile. Other housekeeping, please put your questions into the Q&A box. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, and we'll also be sharing the recording with registrants. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague to share a little bit about participatory methods.
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. I can see quite a number of us here already, so we'll just dive right into it. So there are a lot of conversations around participation. Participation, it's not a word that you haven't heard of, but there's quite some misconceptions and a lot of interventions and activities and programs that come up have shown us the need for us to further understand what participatory truly means. So just as Heather had mentioned, just take some time to tell us or remind us what participatory approaches are and are not. And as you can see on my screen, on the left side, you have something that says tick, and on the right side, you see an X sign. So it's basically what is and what isn't. So you can think about it that way. So firstly, I'd like to say that evidence and also the work that we do, William Davidson Institute and LEAP Africa, has showed us that involving stakeholders in program design or participants that are likely to be reached through our programs, through policies, or even through practice in specific aspects of the study processes has always been a true participatory approach. That also encompasses a wide range of participation types, but it also needs you to be specific about what role they are playing, what they are involved in or are not involved in, and in what way they will be contributing as well. Another way of thinking about participatory approaches is just thinking about a way of working that is meaningful to different stakeholders, especially program participants. And lastly, participation can occur at any stage. It can be at the design stage, it can be at the data collection stage. It can, of course, also be at the data analysis stage, which is something that we don't see quite often because typically you collect the data. Of course, you're likely to do your surveys, push it out into the ecosystem or your participants or stakeholders, and then you do the data analysis in some form of silo, so to speak. There also could be participatory approaches within the reporting systems and even the management systems. But of course, naturally, there are different levels of influence that each stakeholder plays at different points in time. So before I go into what participatory approaches are not, would also like to share that there's quite some clear line between participatory approaches and participatory evaluation. And really, this session is more likely and really truly about participatory approaches than it is about participatory evaluation. So if that was a myth that was not demystified, maybe we have done that right now. So moving on into what participatory approaches are not, there is no single bullet for what participatory truly means in whether it's in the design process and the implementation process, or in the analytical processes, or even the learning processes. There's no single bullet, there's no silver bullet, there's no single method to that. There are a wide range of approaches, and really we're going to talk about a host of them during the course of this conversation, alongside our host, Heather. Um, Another thing that participatory approaches are not is the tokenistic approach of simply consulting stakeholders, or as we call them here, participants, and it's not being methodical or being meaningful, and they're not even clearly understanding what role they are playing and at what stage they will be involved, what the likely outcome of their participation really means. Participatory approaches also are not exclusive to specific evaluation methods. They could be integrated into a wide range of evaluation methods and even research methods as well. And they are also not restricted to quantitative or qualitative data collection and analysis. So that means by inference that they are also used to collect qualitative data, because there's this perception as well that when you are conducting participatory, well, when you're in participatory conversations about participatory approaches, you're likely to start drawing maps or having to collect mostly qualitative data, sharing stories from lived experiences and all of that. But as you would learn today, it's also an approach that could be used to collect quantitative data, and there you can have mixed methods as well. So, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure having you. Welcome, Jennifer. Welcome, Nick. And thank you for joining us. I'll hand over to Heather this moment, and she'll take us right into it. Over to you, Heather.
Great. Thank you so much. So the first two methods that I'm going to share today are ways to frame a system through an iterative process that seeks to understand structures, processes, and functions of the system with input from a range of stakeholders. Mapping and modeling systems are a way to articulate, visualize, and understand systemic structure. And maps and models are a snapshot of time of what's happening from a broad perspective. So as a snapshot in time, you can use them to compare over time if you update them regularly. And before I move on, I'll just share a little bit more. Mapping a system can help with three things. One, clarifying perspectives, interrelationships, and patterns of behavior within a system. Two,
Hello, Heather.
define. Oh yeah.
Sorry, your screen is not moving yet. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Nope. I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna share it in 1 second because I don't want people to start reading that slide. Thank you, though.
Oh,
I appreciate it. Yeah. Yep. And then two, define how pieces of the system connect with each other and form interdependencies and nestedness across the situations, time, and other contexts. And thirdly, help identify what is and is not working and potential levers for change or improvement. So again, these two methods that I'm about to share are ways to frame a system, understand structures, processes, and functions within one from a variety of perspectives. And that is really where the participatory element comes in. So the first one is rich picturing, and then I'm going to talk about rich context maps. So rich picturing, the method, this is an example on the left. They can have words, sometimes they don't have words, but basically the method is that it's a free-form drawing constructed with stakeholders of a system or a process which highlights various stakeholder concerns as well as interactions. So this example here is talking about challenges that this company is having. They have product satisfaction, but the service satisfaction's down, and they're trying to break it down to figure out what's going on from different perspectives, like the sales manager, the sales team, the customer service staff, as well as customer service manager. And you begin to see how different people within that system are perceiving the challenges and where some of those relationships between different stakeholders breaks down or is working well. So an example of how you might use this with entrepreneur support organizations, again, that's the lens we're applying these methods to today, is that an ESO might consider constructing a rich picture to describe the pressure and challenges they face related to financial sustainability, while working with entrepreneurs to incorporate their perspective on the ability to pay for the services the ESO is providing. And I give this example because a lot of ESOs have challenges with financial sustainability. They're donor funded to some degree. Some of the funding that they get is directly from entrepreneurs paying for their programming, but some offer programming for free. So it becomes a very big challenge for an ESO to think about, well, how do I address this and make us more financially sustainable so that we can continue to offer the services we want? And so you could do this rich picturing exercise with first your team within your organization. And then you could bring in other perspectives or do a workshop right off the bat with some of your past participants in your programming as an ESO, with your staff, with people that weren't accepted as well, to begin to understand where are the frustrations, what's working, what's not working. And the real value I see in rich picturing is that it allows you to get out of logic, linear thinking that we often use, like when we're thinking about theories of change and all these models we use. The real thing here and the real value is the goal is not about making the picture, it's about engaging in the deep thinking about what's going on. And so having those conversations. And so a critical step in, of course, understanding any system is to be able to identify its components and describe what's going on. And rich picturing allows you to think about interrelationships, connections, perspectives, and boundaries. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's a snapshot in time that identifies stakeholders, their concerns, the structure underlining the system, and the basic relationships and interactions that connect them. So it does a lot, just a simple picture. The next method I wanted to talk about is rich context mapping. This is a way to start grouping ideas and even some of the ideas from rich picturing. You do not have to do a rich picture before you start doing a rich context map, but you can if you wish. But the idea here, I know this is small, so I'm going to kind of tell you what it says. Here in the center, you start to list out all the long-term trends that are putting pressure on a system and call for change. Then in this donut here, you begin to write out ways the system is currently responding through culture. These are like norms and values. Practices, this is beliefs and how people behave and practices. Then you also put in how the system is responding to those challenges from economic perspective. So this is really about the free market, marketing, financing, consumption, production, distribution. And then the last quadrant here is institutional structure. So rules, regulations, and power structures go here. A lot of government role often goes here about regulations, et cetera. So that's the second circle. And then in this outside area, what you do is you put in emerging niche initiatives. And so these are innovations that are responding. And so you can gather them, like if, say, for example, there's an emerging innovation or a business model that is addressing a challenge within the market, you could put them over near that quadrant. And it's really an interesting way to kind of put a bunch of different perspective and challenges in one place, and you see the tension. So an example of how you might use this, an incubator accelerator might want to create a rich context map and revisit it annually with input from key stakeholders. So that could include entrepreneurs that they're working with, communities they operate within, policymakers, funders, investors, so they can observe how tensions in the broader system have changed over time. And they can use that information to assess how to adapt their programming accordingly to meet the needs of businesses so they serve this ever-evolving ecosystem. And this could also, like when you start to see some of the innovations popping up, it could also lead you to think about how you as an organization want to partner with those leading those innovations, because we're much stronger together. And the real value, I think, in the rich context map is that it's a single page. It's a way to showcase a variety of perspectives and tensions so that you're having the same conversation with a range of different stakeholders about what's working, what's not, and where there's gaps and where there's additional needs. I have two more to share. This one is causal loop. This is I like to think about causal loops as helping understand the system when the focus turns to exploring how structures and influences and processes flow of this and process flows of the system interact with the program. So the first two examples I gave are really helpful when you're trying to frame what's within the system. And then this is kind of you're moving with causal loops. I'd like to think about you're moving from framing the system to understanding the system that you're assessing, and like whether a program has left out important levers of change and whether the program has incorporated critical aspects of a system. So the idea with the causal loop diagram, like this is very basic, you can go in much more depth, but we're trying to give you a feel for all these different types of participatory approaches. You can take key variables from those previous methods that we talked about and draw arrows showing how changes in one variable influence the other. So some people do a plus or an S, the S to stand for strengthening, or a negative or O for opposite to show the causal relationship. And so this example here doesn't really do that. They just show the arrows, but you can see how they start to crisscross. I liked this one because they were different types of business models that they were exploring. And one thing that you can do and go a step beyond creating causal loops is to create story loop diagrams. And I think these are really interesting when you think about participatory approaches, is that it's a way to develop narratives around some of those relationships you're trying to depict in a causal loop diagram. And a story loop is basically writing a story for different types of archetypes that you may be trying to work within your organization or your business. And then you kind of would work through, like, say you're doing one on, I don't know, a good example. Maybe it's an Amazon customer and how they go through the process. Like maybe this is like a mom that doesn't have a lot of time to get out. Like maybe she's a single mom and she's shopping. So like the lower cost structure helps her because she can then just get things at a lower cost. What's her experience? She doesn't have to go drive other places. It's more convenient for her. And you can kind of follow along in a story, in a narrative, what that archetype's perspective and experiences, and that brings to life what the challenges are and what's working. And you can also, in story loop diagrams, kind of envision what a future state, an ideal future state would look like, so that you guys start, as an organization, start to think about where you want to head and what you're offering to those that you're seeking to serve. So an example, an ESO may want to create a story loop diagram for the different types of entrepreneurs, maybe women-led versus male-led businesses that engage with their programming. And that would help the ESO consider how to adapt programming to better meet the needs of various types of businesses they reach. And it really forces you to put yourself in that perspective and that group's shoes. And it's not that you're writing this without them. You're going to be sharing it back with people that represent that target population archetype. So here, the real value I see in using causal loops and story loop diagrams is identifying potential leverage points for change and helping make sense of complex dynamics. The last method that I'm going to share today, a participatory approach, is outcome harvesting. So outcome harvesting is a retrospective 6-step process where the focus is on understanding what changed and why, rather than measuring progress against a plan. It engages stakeholders throughout the process, and final outcomes are determined by the stakeholders. So you can kind of see, here's the 6 steps. In an outcome harvest, you go in order. But the beauty of outcome harvesting and why it is also so participatory is that you're having, I'll walk through these, I suppose. You design the harvest, what kind of outcomes you want to collect. You review existing literature and reports that you've put out based on and I'm very much simplifying the process. We can share in the chat after I'm done talking, I'll share in the chat some references for more reading on outcome harvesting. But look at existing literature, reports of the program or business, and try to fill in what has happened, And then you engage with informants to kind of hear what they say has been the biggest outcomes and changes, and use that to draft out outcomes. And you're really defining in your outcomes, like I like to say that we would put the outcome description in one little couple sentences. Then we do outcome significance, like what's the significance of this outcome in a sentence or two. Then a section that has a few sentences on the contribution of your business or your organization on creating that change. And then I like to also include in my outcome harvesting an alternative explanation of the outcome, like what could have also contributed or caused it. And once you have those all drafted, you go out and you substantiate those outcomes with other stakeholders. So these are other participants, staff, people outside of the direct program. And then you can begin to analyze and interpret your outcomes by themes and groupings. But what I really love, and what I was going to say earlier before I dived into each step a little bit more, is that these are nice feedback loops. And it's really participatory from the standpoint, like say you get to substantiation and your stakeholders are saying, hey, I don't see the outcomes that way. The outcomes can completely be rewritten, and you start back up here with new outcomes framed from your stakeholders' perspective. And then you go through the processes. So it's an iterative process, or it can be. Let's see. So a good example, I was recently at a conference in Nairobi, the Andy Metrics conference, and I loved an example that was shared by the Circular Food System for Rwanda on accelerating circular economy for food. And they used outcome harvesting findings to refine market linkages by embedding outcome harvesting in adaptive management cycles. So I didn't talk about that yet, but I think it's a brilliant way to use outcome harvesting to inform adaptive management and change as the program is ongoing. And in a moment, I'll share more about that program in the chat. So in my perspective, the value of using outcome harvesting for ESOs is that you can capture nonlinear changes and unpredictable causal pathways, which is particularly valuable in the dynamic and complex environments or contexts that we're operating in. It also allows you to document intended results, but also those unexpected results. And it forces, as I just mentioned in that example, real-time learning and adaptation. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Abdullahi.
Thank you, Heather. Those were rich contributions, and what way to advance the conversation. What better way than to speak about systems and critical ways to analyze these pathways. So some of the methods, 3 of them that I'm going to be talking about, really border around systems lens approach. There's focus group discussion and design, and we're going to talk about that as well. And there's also the last one, which I'm quite particular about, and that's design sprints. And that's a method that we don't usually use in this segment of the ecosystem. And we're really hoping to hear your thoughts around what this participatory approaches mean to you. So for the first, in a lot of ways, the systems lens approaches, which some refer to as the systems thinking approach, is a way of understanding and analyzing and even addressing these problems by seeing them as part of a larger interconnected ecosystem. And that's rather than seeing them in isolation or trying to understand them in isolation or trying to analyze or address them in isolation. And by doing that, it means that there's a critical need to look at the relationships, the feedback loops, as Heather had mentioned, and even look at the patterns in which they operate and also the dynamics between each component that has become a part of that system. So what it means is that you move from a linear way of thinking to a dynamic way of thinking. You attempt to fix the problems while you still try to understand the root causes. So you're not just fixing the symptoms, you're actually fixing it from the ground up. So in summary, it's really just a way to analyze the complex systems, seeing how they interact with the different entities within that system, and also seeing the extent to which the interactions among the various components function. And that enables a comprehensive understanding of that system or whatever you're doing at that stage. So let's take, for example, maybe before I switch to the example on the screen, I'll use a more simpler example for starters. Think about you trying to make bread within a factory. But you don't only think about you trying to satisfy your customer. You now take a step back and think about um, where you need to get your resources, the cost of acquiring those resources, the implication of the distance and its limitations. And then you start to think about your client as well. So what systems lens thinking or systems lens approach enables you to do is that it brings you to a thought process of bringing in all those entities, and you ideate, you understand, and you problem solve around what the value truly means for each of them. Now, the example that we share here is a network of entrepreneur support organizations, ESOs. Using this approach to understand why youth-led ventures in rural areas struggle with sustainability, and that is a common problem that we all are likely to have come across. Um, and one example of a systems lens approach, or let me say a subset of systems lens approach, is the critical systems heuristics, which I will share a resource on that after this. And there's more conversations around this that we'll have in this session. But what CSH aims to do is use a framework of trying to understand critically what the boundaries of this system offer and what it will mean to solve the problem for each of them. So that means you need to also define what the system is, what role each element or entity within the system plays, who is likely to benefit from that from that innovation or the solution, and then what will sustainability truly mean for this ESOs and the youth-led ventures in these settings. It's also a great tool that seeks to understand who has been left out, because in a lot of instances, we might agree that you finish everything and then you come back to say, oh, there's an oversight. So it's really a framework. Both critical systems heuristics and the overarching systems lens approach is a good tool to ensure that no one is left behind in the decision-making process and the ideation process and in the value derivation or decision-making process. It's also a good tool that supports the understanding of power dynamics. So you take, for example, as the chart on the screen highlights, which was sourced from um, Sigma Systems, it enables you to zoom in and zoom out and take a look when you're close, and take a different kind of look when you're distant. Just the same way you see things differently when you're using your binoculars and when you're using your eyes. It enables you to think with different perspectives. It enables you to see patterns that ordinarily you wouldn't see because, of course, you've taken that approach of integrating foresight and, of course, not forecasting. Foresight is likely more predictive. Using this is likely less predictive than forecasted, but it's also a good tool to enable you to potentially map out what could happen when you take different pathways. And then it enables you to understand the direction in which you're going to move with little and incremental actions with as much data as we're getting along the process. So for me, one of the major values that this approach, a systems lens approach, and perhaps if you want to integrate a component of it, critical systems heuristic, what it does is that it enables you to have a more holistic view of what the system looks like. So for example, it could be the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and let you see more clearly what leverage points are available to make use of, so that you can have more meaningful and impactful interventions. The next one is also quite linked to systems lens approach, but as I did mention, it is not integral to that. There's so much value in mixing and blending some of these approaches. As we did say, there's no silver bullet for that. So the next one is the design sprint. It's a 5-stage process, as you can see on the screen, hopefully. It's a 5-step process where you understand, you sketch, you design, and you prototype and test in a structured setting. So it is time bound. There's a limited period of time in which you can use the design sprint process. I'm quite enthusiastic about it because I've seen it work especially in the entrepreneurship landscape, where startups, incubators, and accelerators are trying to test whether things are going to work, whether solutions are going to work, whether you can really call it a model at that stage. So you can use it. It was developed by Google Ventures, and well, some models make it work in months and all of that, but in the international development ecosystem where we've applied that, or let me say where I have applied that, sometimes it lasted for maximum of 10 days. So you find that, for example, the first stage, which is understanding the problem, happens in 1 day or two, or even maybe 3 days, or within the same day, depending on the extent of the complexity of the problem, because we thrive in this ecosystem, we seem to thrive on complexities. And what better way to talk about research and evaluation without speaking about complexity in any way? So sometimes it lasts for 2 days or even less, or sometimes more, but it can last. You can think about it of just being blocked into five components. So the first one is understanding the problem, and at that stage, you can, as mentioned, you can bring in the systems lens approach and apply a number of the systems lens methodologies, anyways, which could include critical systems heuristics. And you and your stakeholders sit together and try to understand what the problem is, because what the problem could be for you could likely mean a different thing to someone else. You now move on to the different stage, and you try to sketch what the solution to the problem could look like. And then you move on to decide the best solution after seeing the different alternatives. So if you think about it, there's value in integrating the systems lens approach into this as well, because it enables you to see what is likely to happen when you go into this scenario and go into that scenario or a different scenario altogether. And then you pick one at the third stage, and you move into that, and you try to build a prototype or a solution, or design what you seek, what is likely to be the model at that stage. And when you get to phase five, you're testing it out with a different set of stakeholders, and sometimes with a subset of the stakeholders that played certain roles in the design stage, in the ideation stage, and the design stage, and even the building stage. So moving on to focus group discussion and design, I added and design, and it's for a simple reason. Now I'm very confident that most of us on this right here in this room have heard about focus group discussions. Um, but the value in having a participatory focus group discussion is thinking about it with a design component. So what that means is that you move away from simply having conversations, whether it's 6 persons or 10 persons in the room with a moderator. You move away from that way of focus group discussions to add in a design component. And you can bring in one of the approaches that Heather had exposed us to, which is rich picturing. And you bring in perhaps cardboards. Maybe if it's virtual, you can have whiteboards, maybe Google Jamboard, and a host of other whiteboards platforms that are available. And you try to paint a picture. So when someone makes a statement and you link, there's a linkage to the what maybe let's say the leading indicator or the leading research questions or evaluation questions. You try to request them to sketch out what they've said or what they've stated. And then it means that after listening to them, you get to visualize what really they are saying. And then other people do that. And what happens is that you are now taking, you are now integrating a design component, and even you can go a step further to integrate some aspect of the critical, maybe not the critical systems heuristics, anyways, but you think about um, the different relationships that exist in trying to solve the problem. So let's say, for example, an incubator hosts focus group discussions with early stage entrepreneurs from diverse sectors to evaluate, quote and unquote, the effectiveness of its mentorship offerings. So when you're asking this question, to what extent has the mentorship been effective? You now listen, and then you request them paint a picture or maybe do a sketch or do a linkage of what mentorship has looked like. Okay, they got in through a pathway, and then someone mentored them, and then they got additional resources, and then they got this and that, and then it led them to get into a certain stage that they could not have gotten to without that mentorship. And it could be the other way around. It could let you understand the extent of attribution, or let me say, sorry, contribution of your intervention to where they have gotten to, so that you know more clearly whether it's really the mentorship that has gotten them to where they are, or maybe they are attending other classes and different contributors along the way. So the value for ESOs is that it enables rich qualitative insight and sometimes quantitative as well into the real world experiences, quite likely lived experiences and evolving needs of entrepreneurs, and helps ESOs design or refine programs that are more responsive and user centered. And that leads us to having more improved participant satisfaction or stakeholder satisfaction, or even let's just say client satisfaction and eventual impact. So thank you so much for listening. We'll move right into some few questions. I mean, what's a conversation about research and evaluation and participatory methods without some real-time data collection? So let's dive right into it. Chris. All right. So you will see on your screen, just a thumbs up if you can see the poll on your screen, or any reaction that is more dear to you. All right, thank you. Akolade can see it on the screen. So you can just take some, perhaps 5 minutes or less to respond to the questions. Yeah. So the first question just tries to, maybe it's quite straightforward. Which of the participatory methods presented today have you used in the past? So you can let us know you can let us know which of them you've used before, and then you can move on to let us know which one you intend to apply in the future. And then after this, there's an interactive session I will call upon you to share, but we'll get to that. All right. So if you're done, you can maybe just signify on the chat or use any reaction that you feel like using. Right. So the first question, once again, just trying to understand which of these methods that we spoke about today you've used in the past. So rich picturing, rich context mapping, causal loop and story loop diagrams as well, outcome harvesting, causal loop diagram, systems lens approach, the design sprints, focus group discussion, and or design. And then the same options for the next question, which ones you intend to apply in the future. All right. So I can see some of us done already. If you're done, you can just let us know in the chat box, or you can use a thumbs up sign.
It's interesting. I'm kind of looking at the results over here, and I see that like 81% of those that responded had used focus group discussions in the past. That was the highest one used, and say outcome harvesting was at 50%. Whereas here with what, and this is probably where you're going, like which ones do they plan to intend to use in the future? I'm really interested to kind of see the differences and what might have been low in the first question and high in the second question.
That's quite interesting to note, Heather. And it's not a surprise. I think focus group, the earliest time that I participated in a focus group discussion was when I was still in, I think, high school. So that's quite some time ago. I'm not too old though. I think I look older than I am. But there's really new ideas around how we can make focus group discussions more participatory. And sometimes you can have the participants even lead some of these conversations. You can have them co-lead and just listen to the undertones and distribute the power around the room, so that there's a good blend and someone is not overshadowing leading others to have more bias because of age or because of gender or because of other dynamics. Thank you so much for your response. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I think we can go ahead to hear from you. At this point, we want to hear from you from two standpoints. So the first standpoint, we'd like to hear from two persons. If you would like to volunteer, you can signify or just raise your hand. But we want you to share in 2 minutes, maximum 2 minutes. your experience using participatory methods as data collectors. So we'll get two persons who will speak from a standpoint of data collectors, and then we'll move on to get two persons to share from a standpoint of someone that has participated in sharing the data in a setting that is perhaps participatory or not. So if you're willing to share, you can raise your hand, you can unmute, and then share with us so that we all learn. It's it's a complex ecosystem, and you have conversations, and you find that there are different approaches to doing this or practicing some of these methods. So let's see. Hi, Joshua. Do you want to share? A call a day. Hi, Nick. Hello, Annika. You can just use the raise hand feature and unmute. But it's interesting to see that the participatory approach that was of greatest interest was rich context mapping, and for me, it's quite relatable in a lot of ways. A lot of us are visual learners, so we see some hands already. Akolade was up first, and Jennifer was second. So, Akolade, you have 2 minutes to share, and then we'll go with Jennifer. Over to you, Akolade.
Hi, good afternoon, Abdullahi. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, you are loud and clear on my end.
Yeah, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, and thank you to Ita for that presentation. Yeah, I must say that some of the methods being you both of you shared on this method on this webinar, they are quite new to me. I could have come across them maybe in the course of practice and while studying, but it's not something that I've actually applied, used. So focus group discussion is something that I'm very, very conversant, and I've applied it several times. So I think that's one of the major participatory methods that I've used as a data collector and for the purpose of monitoring and evaluation. So outcome harvesting is also something that I have done. So, and I think something that also came to mind is stakeholders engagements, and that's also a form of maybe a focus group discussion. So, getting stakeholders in the room and getting their perspective in terms of programs developed, programs design at the design stage and across even at midline and every other phases of the program. Yeah, so that's my experience, and thank you very much. It's really great to learn about these methods in this session. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Akolade, for sharing, and really agree with you there as well. Yes, stakeholder engagement is one of the ways through which you can get more relatable data. Jennifer, over to you. You can feel free to unmute. Yeah.
Okay, great. Can you hear?
Yes, audible.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. I realized I was sending my chats to just the hosts and panelists. So I oversee monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning at international development nonprofit called IDE. And we've been investing in participatory methods for the last about 2 years, especially on the evaluation side, though we're trying to expand to the monitoring side as well. So we've mostly focused on most significant change and outcome harvesting so far. We have a plan to do outcome mapping this year. So I'm really excited to see all of these other methods, and some of them look like very low lifts. The main experience I wanted to share is just from like a M&E management perspective. We work in 12 countries. We have a MERL staff of somewhere around 60 across those countries. And so just the sheer cost of training has been a huge barrier. Projects don't necessarily train to pay our staff in these new methods. So we have to find general funding or unrestricted funding to train staff to then be able to implement them in projects. Although occasionally we do find a donor that's open to that. So some of our biggest barriers to expanding our methods are just being able to actually ensure our staff has the skills. And when new staff come on or there's staff turnovers, those are sort of additional challenges. So thanks so much for sharing some of these lighter lift methods potentially.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jennifer. Quite interesting to hear. And I do agree with you that it's usually quite more costly and time consuming to be truly more participatory, or let me say truly participatory, if you're not going to be merely tokenistic and fulfill all optics. So I think we'll move on to get to hear from two persons that have shared data before from that perspective. Imagine the perspective of having data collected from you in a participatory manner. And you can think of any experience that maybe borders around this. It doesn't have to be this specifically. So we'd call upon, I don't know if it's okay to do this, but I don't know if Carla, you want to share. Joy, Philippi, Joshua, Ruben. Please don't feel bad if I didn't call you. So if you want to share, you can just unmute your mic. You can raise your hand and mute your mic and go ahead. Imagine a scenario where you shared data and you really felt that you were being included and you were truly participating in that process. Yeah.
Hey, I can share one while we wait. I still remember, I'll do the 2 minutes as well, but I remember in high school, I was a part of this like data gathering. It had adults in our community and some students from the high school involved in how to improve the community. And I don't remember the exact research focus. Like I was just a high school student, had no idea I was getting this line of work. But we had a focus group, and some really well-known leaders that were adults in the community were there, and they were asking questions, the moderator. And I spoke up about some things that I noticed and felt and had observed in the community from the perspective of a young adult. And I remember afterwards, one of those leaders came up to me and like said how much my comment resonated with them and that they hadn't really thought about that and from that perspective, and that was really valuable for them. So I remember feeling validated because it felt scary coming into this focus group with these people that had these great jobs. I was still in high school, had no idea what I was going to do. And then someone afterwards kind of saying, thanks so much for sharing on this one-on-one perspective, and saying how it influenced and changed their view on a topic that we were discussing.
Yeah, and thank you, Heather, for sharing. And that's even an example from way back. I don't want to imagine when Heather was in high school. But thank you, Heather, for sharing. So I think it means that we have some similar experience. But yeah, so if there's no more hands in the room, I guess we can move on into. Okay, I think ID has great male initiatives. Keep pushing, Jennifer. Thank you, Christine, for the shout out. Yeah. So we're going to go into the session survey, and yeah, and we have just some few questions. And for me, there's the first one as a favorite question, and for us, it's also because we don't see this as a one-off. We don't expect that even 2 hours or a whole day or 2 years is enough to fully break down what participatory approaches are and are not, and to even hear from you and listen to your experiences. So we have this survey that asks you a set of questions, and one of them is whether or not you would like to join a community of practice on participatory methods. But hey, you'll get to get the rest of the questions on the survey. Hi, Chris. Yeah. So kindly confirm that you can see the questions on your screen. Just a thumbs up will be fine, or any reaction that you would like to use. All right. Okay, thank you, Kolade. So we have some few minutes, give or take 5, to respond to the questions. They're very short. Part of the lessons we're learning in this ecosystem is that surveys are not a favorite thing as well. So we thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas as well.
Yeah, and based on interest, we Leap Africa has a community of practice already on Merle, and so our thoughts are if we get a lot of interest, we'd love to start a community of practice, like a subgroup within that meets at a regular cadence to continue the conversation and learn from each other on participatory approaches, so we can inspire each other, help troubleshoot. I think we all see the great value in it, but there are challenges. And I think as you guys keep continuing filling out that survey, we'd really appreciate it. We'll start the Q&A. We have one question that came in so far, so feel free to add others, but I see in the Q&A box we've got one that says, how resource intensive are these different approaches? Can we adapt these tools to resource constrained environments without diluting the intended impact? And so this was asked earlier in the session around 9:24, and so we've gotten into some of talking about that this can be resource intensive, participatory approaches. It can slow things down as well. So I think I'll talk about that and then give some ideas as well. And those are some of the topics we want to talk about in a community of practices, like how can we adapt these tools to utilize them more in a less resource intensive way. So one comment is sometimes one thing that I like to think about with participatory approaches is that quote, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And with the going far being creating more meaningful and sustainable impact, because I truly believe, and I think many of us on this call believe, the more we incorporate different perspectives, the better the project or the program or the service offering we can provide, because it will better meet the needs of different stakeholders. But that, again, it takes more time. I also think that another big challenge can be the cost if you're going to go really in depth in a rigorous way with some of these approaches. And another challenge can also be gaining the trust of your stakeholder group. So if you already don't have a good relationship or a strong relationship with the stakeholder groups that you want their perspective, I would suggest that as a first step, start building that through your organization. Now, I think there are different ways to utilize participatory approaches, because again, at the beginning, Abdullahi talked about how we're talking about participatory approaches today, not necessarily participatory evaluation. Participatory evaluation is the goal. We would love to do that all the time, but it is so hard from design to finish to do participatory evaluation and integrate it across because of the funding dynamic there. So if we start to see more funders interested and driving that change, that could be a great change and a signal for the rest of us. But I think the goal of this session was to kind of show that, to Jennifer's point, was that you can use some of these here and there to get some really useful insights. It would be great to do a participatory evaluation, but a lot of these, there are low lift ways to start using them in a light touch way, and then you can go more in depth as you start to see the value of using them. I'll stop there. Abdullahi, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, really. I think the only thing perhaps I'd like to add is that we're led in, especially with the recent funding cuts and the major shifts in the global world of funding. A lot of funders are now more interested in really telling the stories that matter, and you don't get to tell those stories unless you don't get to tell those stories unless you have them. You can get to have these stories unless you truly work with the different and diverse stakeholders at the different stages. And as Heather had mentioned, in a lot of ways, these are somewhat of more less costly approaches that we can integrate. Sometimes when the systems lens approach, the causal loop diagram and pathways are things that we can integrate into already existing systems and processes. So at Leap Africa, we had this conversation recently around how to design programs. So of course you can have your needs assessments happen, but what stops you from after you have this the survey go out, you still bring in some of the respondents into the design room and you have conversations with them, especially those that were more responsive with the open-ended questions, so that you can really paint tell them what the analysis, the insights from the analysis looks like, and then they can tell you whether that was truly what they meant, because there could be some misinterpretation that happens sometimes even after analysis had been completed. So in a lot of ways, there's more power in telling the stories. You can tell stories you don't have. You don't get to inspire the emotions that come up from an effective intervention as well when you don't engage in truly participatory methods. Participatory is a word that when you put out on the internet, you'll see it come up very often. But when it comes to practice, because of the funds that you require to put in, because of the time it requires to take, Sometimes it's not really so much more fun. Sometimes it's just additional considerations that, yes, will take you some more time to achieve, but in a lot of ways, you can think about how to bootstrap around some of these. Yeah. So that's
Thank
all I
you.
have to add, Heather.
I'm going to share two last questions, and maybe we can answer those really quickly because they relate in some ways. From Kristen, I have used many of these methods and think they add great value, but given that they require skilled staff to lead these things, especially something like outcome harvesting, causal loop diagramming. How do you think that ESOs would find access to these skills? And I'm reading right into the next question, sorry. The second question from an anonymous participant was, how do you think that ESOs would find access to these skills, and how would they afford these processes? Do you have a sense of the ROI from investing in these processes for incubators and accelerators, coming from someone that loves these methods, but they can be hard to sell because of cost and time? I think these are really both spot on. I believe that there are tools out there in trainings, and that's why I think that you could leverage to upskill your staff. But I also think that a community of practice might be a great place for us to come together and try to build the case of what the ROI is, because I don't have something to point to on that. I also think that to the earlier question, I didn't really mention this, but I do think that there's ways to integrate participatory approaches into existing processes you already have, like adding a question that helps you get more participatory input. And then you're kind of being strategic about how you slowly are becoming a more participatory focused organization. Abdullahi, I had to go real quick, so we're almost out of time. Let me see if you got anything to add for those two questions.
Thank you, Heather. And maybe I will share a very, very short story. So one of the ways I got exposed to design sprints in the world of international development was with a short work that I had done with British Council years ago. And when I had conversations with them, I joined in and they were already using the method anyways. And when I had conversations, I realized that for them, there was little to no additional cost. Because what it meant was that after the respondents, after the survey data had been analyzed at the needs assessment level, all that had to happen was dedicate 5 days to a virtual set of conversations around those 5 stages: understanding, the probing, the design, the testing, and all of that. So what it meant was that there was little to no additional cost, but there was so much more value. However, it's not to say that a whole 1 week is not much lost, because again, it's a complex ecosystem. Sometimes funders or donors or your partners want you to accelerate the results. But dedicating 5 days to a design sprint just to walk around the insights or what the likely results of the evidence will mean with the respondents is not a bad addition. So I think that's just the story of that. It might translate to other things that we do, but sometimes it's really just to test some of these ideas and approaches in little ways, some sort of pilot before you move on to maybe put more money into it. Because truly, even if the funders or the donors don't speak about the cost implication, you should think about it from a standpoint of value addition. So, and when you test it out in little pilots with shorter period of time, you really get to your context which participatory approach is likely to work and deliver the value that you've been seeking. So that's just the one addition I have, Heather.
You said it so well, and a great way to wrap up the session. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation, and we hope it's the start of many more conversations together through a community of practice.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Abdullahi.